It was my fourth day on the trapline, and the storm pressed the tent flat between gusts. I checked the stove draft by feel, counted the remaining billets by burn time, and scraped rime from the stovepipe collar with a gloved knuckle. I rotated damp socks under my parka, taped a split knuckle, and chipped ice from the guy line knots. The damper pin had frozen, so I warmed the awl under my ribs and worked it through the slot until the plate moved cleanly. The flame steadied and steam thinned. Another hour of heat banked without flagging smoke. I melted a mug of snow, greased the bootlaces, and repacked the sled crown tight under the tarp. Fresh wolf tracks circled in and out of the headlamp's edge, holding the lee side. I tied a lifeline from the center pole to the toboggan and set a bait slab by the door, ready to draw the pack across the wind when I stepped out. The taiga flattened into scrub and low larch, each branch filmed in ice. The creek bed drifted to a single white plain. Wind carved slabs along the windward side of the tent and buried the toboggan to the gunnels, so I dug it out in knee-high sweeps and kicked a trench to cut the drift. I banked the tent skirt with fresh snow, packed it tight with my boot heels, and brushed the canvas to keep the frost from cementing the folds. Visibility sat at 3 meters, and the skirt lifted 2 fingers at the worst of each gust. I melted snow in the small pot and set the coil to warm the next batch, rotated socks inside my parka, and massaged feeling into my fingers before they stiffened enough to lose grip. I scraped ice from the bootlaces, rubbed a thin film of fat into the leather, and checked the mitt stitching where the thread had started to feather. The stove spit moisture from the damp rounds, so I split the least wet billets down to finger width and stacked by heat, not by size, to keep the draft clean. The guy lines pulled the poles taut, so I loosened the windward pair and re-anchored them into packed snow, then braced the center pole with a short larch stick. I cleared the chimney cap with the awl, opened a small scoop in the lee to feed the draft, and breathed through my scarf until the smoke thinned. The headlamp showed wolf tracks doubling back along my earlier path and settling on the far side. I wiped the lens, cinched my hood, and coiled a lifeline to reach the toboggan without losing the tent in the blur. Dry rounds ran low, and the remaining wood felt heavy and wet, each piece darker at the core. I shelved the biggest billets and worked the driest by weight, shaved a feathered pile with the knife tip, and kept a thin coal bed alive for my time outside. The gloves lost shape with ice, so I swapped to liners under mitts and tucked the spares against my ribs to warm. The storm pushed scent downwind from the tent, and the tracks tightened their circle. I needed one run to the reserve bundle lashed under birch bark on the toboggan, and I wanted the path masked. I cut a slab from old fish skin, tied it to cordage for control, and set it to throw across the crosswind so the pack would drift where I aimed, not where I walked. I ran a lifeline from the center pole to the sled and marked distance with knots I could count with numb fingers. Then checked the carabiner gate for ice and clipped in. The stove fought damp fuel. The tent cooled by degrees. I split the smallest billets to finger width and stacked them for maximum surface area. The coals brightened enough to hold while I made the outside trip. I stepped into the drift and let the lifeline lead, counting knots to pace the distance. Waist-deep powder collapsed at the hips, so I cut a shallow trench by shuffling, then stamped sidewalls to hold shape for the return pull. The headlamp collapsed to a white disc. I worked by the line's pull and the tug of wind on my hood. At the sled, I brushed snow from the tarp, searched for the lashings by touch, and freed the birch bark bundle with a mittened thumb on the half-hitch. The first tug slid the bundle under the runners, so I lay on my side to reach, locked my elbow against the rail, and levered it free. I pulled the bundle to my chest and slid it under the parka to keep it dry. I checked hands for blanching and warmed the fingers in my armpits before they stiffened. I tightened the hip belt, clipped the bundle to the D-ring, and backed along the trench, keeping the cord taut so I wouldn't overstep in the whiteout. At the tent, I tapped snow from the parka hem, shook ice out of the hood fur, and crawled inside without dragging powder across the floor space. I opened the bundle and split billets to quick-burning slats, set the damper for a controlled draw, and rebuilt the fire on the bright coals. I fed the stove in small sequenced charges so the moisture flashed off without choking the draft. Flame ran steady and heat returned through the floor pads as the tent skin eased. I hung the liners over the ridge rope, turned the mitts under my ribs to finish drying, and laid 2 thumb-thick slats aside as insurance for the next outside run. I checked the lifeline for ice, recoiled it in loose loops, and set the bait slab within reach by the door. The trench outside would hold for one more pass if the wind didn't fill it, so I cleared the skirt again and pressed the packed snow firm. The system was set. The next move would be the toss. I clipped back into the lifeline and stepped out with the bait slab in my pocket, the dry bundle stacked by the stove and the damper set to hold. Wind built seams along the trench, so I recut the path by dragging my shins and stamped the sidewalls again for support. The headlamp showed wolves across the drifted creek bed. Holding station at the edge of the beam, I planted both feet in the trench, gauged the crosswind, and threw the bait high and far so the scent would ride away from the return line. The pack edged downwind toward the bait in a single drift. I counted knots with one hand and moved backward along the cord, keeping the line tight so I wouldn't walk past the tent. Inside, I split 2 billets to pencil width and laid them over the coal bed. I opened the damper a finger's width and held the stove door to keep the draw smooth. The wet hiss faded and the slats lit clean. Heat rose from my knees to my chest as the burn steadied and the steam left the pipe. I stacked the next sequence of slats, set the spare pair aside for a later feed, and checked the stove legs so they wouldn't creep on the pads. I pulled the lifeline in to clear it of ice and laid it in loose coils near the door. The trench outside would fill again if the wind shifted, so I pressed fresh snow against the skirt and smoothed it flat with my gloves. The headlamp's edge showed the wolves pacing downwind, busy with the bait and angled away from the tent. The system held heat steady, draft clean, exit clear if needed. I checked each finger for blanching and warmed them in my armpits until the sting settled to a dull throb. I melted snow to a slow sip and felt for grit on my teeth to be sure the pot wasn't fouled. I rubbed a little fat into the boot uppers and relaced them firm so the ankles wouldn't roll when I broke trail in the morning. I logged what I had. Dry wood stacked by burn time, damp billet split and set to finish drying, cordage coiled, bait used, fish skin gone. I rolled the tent edge to clear ice and packed a fresh snowbank against the skirt so it would seal when the wind shifted. The lifeline came in and looped to my breast pocket, pre-fed for a clean release at first light. I adjusted the damper to a low draw, banked the coals, and laid 2 thumb-thick slats on top to hold a slow burn without smoke. Fuel banked for roughly 6 hours at this setting. I set my mitts under my ribs to finish drying and kept my socks inside the parka. The wolves paced the far side and then drifted downwind in a loose line. Heat held. The canvas stopped twitching and I closed my eyes to wait for gray light.